It's been my privilege over a 40-ish year career in politics and polling to have walked the streets and visited the pubs of a hell of a lot of our small towns and villages. Antler, Saskatchewan, Fort Macleod, Alberta, Stellarton, Nova Scotia. Those are just a few of well over 200. I'm a lucky man. Rural Canada, its people and its potential, has always been vital to this country. And digital connectivity in our small places has never been more important than it is right now. Government is committed to that, and so is our presenting sponsor, TELUS. Not just the company, its people. Just last April, about a month into the pandemic, power disappeared in the Hamburg oil patch. The Hamburg patch is remote, hours northwest of Grande Prairie, Alberta, near the BC border. With no cell service, workers had no way to contact their families in an already anxious time. TELUS network technician Nathan Doris hit the road immediately for the 16-hour journey. He wouldn't arrive until well into the night, driving through utter darkness, rain turning to sleet, feeling his way along paved roads that became rough gravel. No GPS because no cell tower. Nathan made it. He set up the generators that restored power to the cell site while repairs to infrastructure got underway. The people of the Hamburg patch could communicate with the outside world again. This ongoing work to connect rural Canada is so important to TELUS. They believe in bridging digital divides so that all Canadians are connected to the technology and resources we need to thrive. You can learn more about it by going to connectingcanadaforgood.ca. For the past couple of weeks, we've been telling you about the drama behind the government's decision to privatize CN Railways, just about exactly 25 years ago this week. Well, today we're going to tell you some more. As faithful listeners will recall, it was a monster sale of a monster company. At the time, the single biggest IPO, actually the single biggest business transaction in Canadian history. Think about that. How do you sell off a giant crown corporation with an unproductive, bloated workforce, boxcars of debt, antique technology, government-style notions of customer service, and a history of being used for political patronage? In the middle of a referendum in the province where the company is headquartered. How do you coax investors into laying out $2.25 billion for all the new shares? Answer: you turn the company around, then bulldoze politicians who object, which is exactly what Paul Tellier did. In 3 short years, Tellier sliced thousands of jobs, management and union. He modernized the company's trains and technology. He and his team found more efficient ways of running the railroad and insisted on putting customers first. He made public speeches conceding that Canada's railways had been incompetently and ineffectively managed. And as a former clerk of the Privy Council, Tellier knew better than anyone else how to deal with CN's regulators, bureaucrats, and political masters in Ottawa. He did what he had to do. It didn't make him very popular, but it sure worked. It turned CN into an early version of the highly efficient, world-class railroad it is today. Oh, and when the shares finally went on sale that day on November 17, 1995, they were at least 8 times oversubscribed. The investment brokers handling the sale got into yelling matches over their allocations. It turned out to be one of the greatest business success stories in Canadian history. Today, it continues. I am both thrilled and honored to have back with us today Ace Smith from San Francisco. Ace was on our program to talk about his great book on Satchel Paige, among other things, a couple of years ago. Then he was gracious enough to invite me down to San Francisco to hang out with him during the midterm elections. Nobody knows more about California than Ace Smith. Nobody knows more about the electoral system than Ace Smith. And Ace Smith is also the senior advisor throughout her career to Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. He has kind of busy because Ms. Harris is giving a primetime address tonight. So he's kind of busy, but he's given up some time for us. So Ace, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's truly an honor.
Yeah. Everybody up here is trying to follow along with the game. We don't know what all the rules are. We're intensely fascinated by it. But the process is kind of unfolding. Even though I was stunned election night and I was stunned for a couple of days after, I don't know why I was. Because you explained all this to me 2 years ago in the midterms in the context of Tony Thurmond, who was running for school board superintendent and on election night was down by 250,000 votes. And so the next morning, Mike Spitali and I gave our condolences to you about Tony, and you looked at us like we were crazy, and you said, oh no, he's going to win. When all the votes come in, he will have won. And so, and you explained the mail-in voting process to us in California. Now, I guess we're just seeing this in the rest of the country now in the way that we haven't seen this before, but this is actually all quite normal to you. Is that right?
Oh, it's for, if you do politics in California, you know, that's how you make your living. The real race, and Tony's race took about maybe a week to figure out, but the probably the most famous race in California history involving mail-in ballots is then a San Francisco District Attorney Kamala Harris's race for Attorney General, a race that people said could not, what was impossible. And I will never forget that night. It was literally 10 years ago, where we were at this small back room in a place in San Francisco. And I had tried to find like the most out of the way table possible. And I set up at the very end to be out of the way to watch the results come in. And we were way behind at the beginning. And they kept on rolling in. And we got closer and closer. And then as we approached the 11 o'clock hour, which is where, kind of all the local news happens and you go out live, our opponent went on TV and declared victory. And so, of course, while I'm trying to stay to the side, all of a sudden everyone is around my computer at this point, and we're going, literally county by county, figuring out what's happened. And I'm convinced that they're just dead wrong. And a little minor thing, but you have to be a Californian to really understand this. But one of the things that was ridiculous was Alameda County, which is where Berkeley and Oakland is, had reported 0 votes. And it was like, I knew that was going to come in and fall like an anvil on these guys' toes. But anyway, so P.S., the 11 o'clock hour is coming. Our opponent has declared victory. And it's time for her to go out and address the crowd of all of her supporters. And as she walks out, she's walking out and she realizes that everyone is crying. And she gives her speech about same speech she's giving today. Let's count all the votes, et cetera, et cetera. And she comes back. She said, that was very touching. Everyone was crying. And it was like they were crying because one of the major newspapers in the state just reported that you lost the race. They literally declared it. And of course, they were dead wrong.
Really? Yeah.
And we truly probably one of the last real Dewey Truman type situations. And we went back in and watched the results, and finally Alameda County came in and the lead flipped. And we may have lost it a few times in the 2 or 3 weeks it took to count all the votes. But, just like with this race, the parallels are just striking. An opponent who declares victory with no good reason on election night, a bunch of media outlets, maybe panicking. And, who was the coolest head of all? Kamala Harris. And her line was the same line now, which is, let's just count all the votes.
It is, he set this up for so long that he was going to act this way, that he was going to challenge these mail-in ballots, challenge the legitimacy of these mail-in ballots, that he kind of inured everybody to it. But it is catching a lot of people by surprise. And if it hadn't looked so obviously like a tactic on his behalf, he might have had more success with this.
The irony of ironies is here's a man who is just devoid of any knowledge of history or the real inner workings of things. But the irony of the mail-in ballot was when it really emerged first in California about 25 years ago, was it really gave the Republicans a huge advantage. And because if you think about it, it's those folks are the perfect people actually, if you think about it just kind of hypothetically, and like because you do the same thing I do, it makes sense, right? Wealthier, college educated folks, talk about an easy path to vote. And the Republicans actually beat us election after election after election until the Democrats finally wised up and said, this could actually be used to our advantage. And the irony is it's completely flipped, but that's just a long way of saying that there was actually a huge built-in advantage for both sides if you know how to use it. And why he threw it away is just beyond me.
Right. So now, a couple of months ago, you were writing about a number of scenarios that could occur in a challenged election involving state legislators and the way electoral college voters are selected and all sorts of things. Do you see at the moment, plausible or not, any avenues for Trump to challenge this?
No, there's nothing plausible. You'd have to be to do any of the scenarios. The most plausible scenario would be for one state to essentially say, we can't really come to a result for whatever reason. And because in the Constitution, you're allowed to actually select the electors any way the state legislature wants. You could literally just say, we've decided the state legislature votes that all the votes will go to Trump. There's just they'd have to do it in too many states and too many places where there's Democratic governors, and even though it's not feasible, it's not doable, and even they're not insane enough to do that.
They're not, eh? Do you think the Republicans are going to abandon Trump on this pretty quickly, or are they going to rally around his attempt to hang on?
I've heard that for 4 years. And I've never seen anyone leaving that ship. If anything, just more people to go on.
Right. So you think they're going to go down with the ship on this? So what? I just want to put all the things on the table. People, at least in Canada, have been musing about looking at the states and saying, is there potential violence as a result of this election result?
I don't think so. I think probably we probably hit the really like the biggest tinderboxes over the summer, and there was some ugliness, but I think there'll be a lot of belly aching, but minimal violence.
I've been wondering about this question because of the more it looked like Trump was representing the last stand of white America, and as a white grievance candidate, as Stuart Stevens called him on this podcast, that people who support him for that reason might be prepared to do more extreme things than just vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah, we've seen that. But I would just say, and you've probably read this book, I think the best book written on American politics was written before the 2016 elections, and it was written about French politics by a French geographer. You probably read the book, Twilight of the Elites by Christophe Joly. And there's some conspiracy theory stuff in the book I don't buy, but his essential argument, and I think there's just too much truth to this, is that you've had this amassing of wealth and power along the coasts of a lot of these countries, creating essentially liberal elites. These places are ringed by service folks, but then the interior of the country is full of people who feel both economically and politically and power sense completely dealt out. And that's real. And Trump realized that. That's how he got elected. That's how he did as well as he did this election. A lot of that stuff in a different, kind of form animates the Sanders voters as well. I mean, if you're a young person and you've graduated college and you realize you're going to have to work the next 10 years of your life just to pay off your college debt before you can even save a dime, buy a house or anything. I mean, what's happened is because of the deep and profound inequality, economic inequality, that's really at the root of this. And it's not rhetoric, and rhetoric is just something that moves things that are already moving, and that thing was moving.
But those are supposed to be our voters, Ace. Like, we're the people who care about those people.
Well, the fact of the matter is this, is that if you go to, there was a great story in New York Times about rural Poland and about how all these villages which had most benefited, they had fire stations and roads from the EU, hated the EU the most. Politics, as you know, it's an emotional, it's not people. I've had decades worth of arguments with economists who like to believe that people vote their economic self-interest. This is not true. People vote their emotions. And if you have hurt feelings and feel like dealt out, which is how these folks feel, you're not going to vote for the folks who are seen as the establishment. It's a huge challenge.
Are you familiar with Chris Arnotti's book, Dignity?
No.
Okay.
Tell me about it.
Chris Arnotti's an investment banker from Wall Street who got disillusioned and quit his job and went to the poorest parts of America, the poorest communities or neighborhoods in America, and hung out at the McDonald's and wherever else people hang out in those places and documented them, got to know them, lived with them, and documented them in a book. And he appropriately called it Dignity.
Okay.
And because that's what they're searching for, and that's what they want, and that's what they don't feel that those elites that you're talking about give them. A lot of it was about a credentialed society, about how many Americans are just not even on a ladder or a track where they could ever get anywhere because they don't have the right credentials or the right social status. So he documents this in a very interesting way. Perhaps the most disturbing thing he told me when he was on was that he had more interest in his book from Republicans than he did from Democrats.
That's too bad. And there have been, as you know, a number of other books like that, especially it came, Hillbilly Elegy, and there was another one. The one thing that I have not read that book, that I think is, the place where too many people in my party end up after reading those things is in the belief that if we just message things better, if we just say things a little bit differently. And I don't fundamentally believe that. I fundamentally believe that that in the short term, you're not going to change people's minds. But in the long term, if, and Franklin Roosevelt proved this, right? In the long term, if you do improve people's lives and you do, it's not just a matter of talking points, and you do fundamentally change their circumstances, that's how you have success.
Do you have any thoughts about how to manage the race issue going forward? Like, from a distance, it's very striking to look at the white vote in America and how Trump, after 4 years of Trump, a majority of white people looked at him and said, that's still my option. And it makes me think that if I was an American, maybe I would be different. Maybe I would think of things differently, because maybe I can't really understand what's going through the minds of white Americans right now. But they've got to be voting at least as much on race as they are on anything else.
Well, in my experience, there's always a segment of voters, and it does affect everything you do. But I'm kind of an optimist on this ultimately. I think that there's a certain built-in chunk of the electorate that, there was a certain built-in chunk of the electorate that voted for George Wallace in '68, okay? That you're not going to necessarily move. But I actually think most of the folks in the middle who are persuadable and they're the ones who win elections are not racists and actually would like to see improvements in both criminal justice reform. And time and again in California, we've passed really landmark criminal justice reform measures. And I've always been struck by when you actually appeal to people's good angels, really the support you can get. And in many of these cases, we got nearly 2/3 support for things that were considered radical ideas, like reforming the three strikes law, like fundamentally reforming. Another thing we did was fundamentally reforming a lot of the felony laws that were throwing people in jail for rather minor things. So some really striking things like that, and they're achievable and they're doable. So I'm an optimist. It'll take time, but we'll get there.
Okay. I'm in the polling business, and there appears to have been yet another major polling error in this election, perhaps a larger polling error than occurred in 2016. We'll need to see when all the results are in. But, well, first of all, before we get into it, like, what did you see? What do you think about that? How am I supposed to go to my clients next week and tell them that they can trust what I'm delivering to them as data?
Well, you live in a different world than me, and I'm sure your polling's spot on. But the but you actually, I don't think you have as tricky of a job as the pollsters in this country have. I really don't. I think you live in a different country that's not that is maybe, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but is, I don't think there's as many things hiding around the corners. But I mean, polling in this country, it's fundamentally broken, right? And the thing I find so frustrating is we've had, really three big crises in polling in this country. People forget this, but in 1936, the famous Literary Digest poll, which had been the touchstone for polling since 1916, predicted that Al Landon was going to wipe out Roosevelt. Of course, it was not true, even though they had, I think it was something like 4.5 million respondents. Well, guess what? They were all upper middle class folks, in largely rural areas, et cetera, et cetera. So, that is, there became a professionalism after that, but people agreed that you need to have a decent sample, a representative sample. And then you hit the 48 election, and their problem wasn't necessarily that they were wrong. They weren't wrong. They just stopped polling like 2 weeks or 3 weeks before the election. So there was no dynamism, time frame dynamism in that polling. And it's remarkable. I'm maybe the only crazy person who owns this book. There's a book which came out after that race where the social scientists in America got together with professional pollsters, and they literally figured out what was wrong, and they released findings, and they tackled it. And what I found astounding was the last election was a debacle, and that didn't happen. And now we just had another debacle, and people aren't. And so what's the matter? I mean, very simply, I can tell you all the problems. I mean, there's still people doing, phone polling, which I think is, where you're talking to a very small amount of the electorate, and it's ridiculous. You have a bunch of people doing online polling, not knowing well enough who they're talking to. You have essentially what I call the lying factor. You don't have enough skepticism in the instruments. And, for instance, as if you ask people what their history of voting is, they'll always tell you it's perfect. If you ask them what they're going to do before they vote, they're going to tell you that they're going to study things intensively on the internet. And then you look up their profile and you realize they voted one in the last 10 elections. And then race is also, it's tremendously tricky. And I think in some ironic way, I think the Republicans have figured out how to understand that better than the Democrats have. And then there's just this, I think kind of one of the most fascinating, I'm probably going to get way too technical here. One of the most fascinating questions is this. I had a pollster who, at the end of the 2016 race told me that they were haunted by the fact that they were getting a record number of terminations, and it killed them that they hadn't taken the time to essentially go look in the trash can at who those folks were to try and understand. Right. Because in your business, you kind of assume that the folks who terminate or don't finish are a random sample of the rest of the world. And they were always haunted by the fact that those were probably 80% Trump voters, who just thought, after a couple of questions, it was fake news or Democrats or whatever. And they, and that we never went back and frankly.
They could tell just by the way the questions were worded that it wasn't by them, right?
Exactly. And so, so like, understanding what that is, and then putting your finger on the scale to say, okay, we need to, we have like a termination rate over here, and we're not accounting for like 5 or 10% of the electorate because they're just hanging up on us. So the crudest thing you can do, as is to just put your finger on the scale and weight it differently. But how about just even taking a look at that?
Well, and waiting's very fraught exercise.
Yeah.
Did it affect the campaign in the sense that, John Anzalone was on the show. He was extremely confident a month before the election. Stuart Stevens was on the show the week before the election, and he was extremely confident. But if you thought that Wisconsin was within 20,000 as opposed to within 15 points, you might do something different, right?
I think they ran a really smart race, and they had it cooked in that they had to win those 4 states, or really run hard, and also, Florida, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and run hard at Arizona and Nevada. They always had that cooked in, and were, Anzalone is an incredible pollster. He also has the battle scars to understand that. So I don't think that. I think where it actually affects them, ironically, is not in their strategy to win the election, which they did brilliantly. It affects them in the fact that I think the American public is looking at this whole thing and believing that it was going to be a blowout, and wondering what the heck happened. I think it undermines you coming into a new administration profoundly.
Because the win seems less than it actually is somehow, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it should seem bigger than it is, because it's huge. And so it's just, I think that's the now, and they'll overcome it. They're incredibly smart people, capable people, but it's like, kind of starting, at a little bit of a disadvantage that has nothing to do with reality, because there was this complete mirage created by faulty polling.
Yeah, I know, which I believed, and as a result lost every pool I entered, and also was crushed on election night when Charlie Cook's forecast of a realignment and a repudiation of Trump didn't happen. It was a very tough night to get through. Even though I knew it was still likely Biden was going to win, I hadn't gotten the repudiation of Trump that I wanted.
Yep. Couldn't be said more true.
What was the campaign ultimately about? What was the ballot question do you think people were answering when they voted?
Since we live in such a divided country, I think there were 2 questions and 2 sets of questions, and the folks who went with Trump answered one set of questions, and the folks who went with Biden answered the other set of questions, and there were questions that each of the campaigns posed. But the thing that has struck me, being, having done campaigns, dating back to the 70s, and I'll just give you an example from California, because we have this crazy homegrown poll called the Field Institute poll, which has had data from all the way from 1948 to the present day. And so you can actually ask many of the same questions, but just an illustration of where we sit today. Jerry Brown, elected in 1974. If you go back and look at his internals, his positives and negatives, in his first governorship, right, almost 4 decades ago, what you found was that there were a group of people on either side. There may be, let's say, a third, just for easy math. And there's a third of people in the middle who we called like Rockefeller Republicans, Reagan Democrats, and independents, right? And they actually more or less, with a little bit of tinge, they kind of called balls and strikes. And when they thought he was messing up, they would give him bad marks. And when they thought he was, but okay, Jerry Brown becomes governor again, right? He's elected governor in 2010. And you go look at his internal numbers, and he was a moderate, and he was a fiscal conservative. Like all the Republicans just dial it like 90-10. It didn't matter what he did. And so there is, think of it this way. It's like the politics I grew up in, where maybe much more, and I hate using battle analogies, but they work here, much more like, say, a civil war or a 19th century with a lot of fluidity in it. Man, the elections we have today are much more like World War I battlegrounds, where there's people literally dug in the trenches, and there's not a lot of land up for grabs in the middle, and God forbid if you walk out in the middle, you get shot.
Right. So has that changed the nature of campaigning from an attempt to persuade people to support your position or your candidate to a pure attempt at mobilizing the people who already do support your candidate?
That's a great insight. More and more is the latter. More and more is turnout, firing up your base. I'll say one thing that you may find striking as a pollster. When I get top lines in California, I ask for two sets of top lines. I ask for a set of top lines of Republicans and then everyone who's not a Republican, because I know I can't move the Republicans. And so why am I going to even?
So you just want them out of the sample?
Yeah. Why do I want to look at it? Because there's nothing I can say to persuade them. So I care about and what actually happens is it really messes up your thinking since they dial things so radically that you actually think things are way less popular than you could imagine, because like they just dial things 100% one way anyway, and it's like, and you're not going to change their mind. So it's sad, but why should I take that into account?
Right. So we haven't talked during COVID, Ace, but up here in Canada, our governments have been consistently telling us all the same things about wearing masks and social distancing, and we've been locking down our societies when the cases get too high, and everybody in Canada is being a good boy about this. And we've watched the craziness in the United States about COVID with a lot of sadness and superiority.
Yep.
Why wasn't that a bigger factor in this race? Why didn't that hang around his neck like an albatross? The fact that this disease is out of control in the U.S. in a way it is almost nowhere else, certainly inexplicably in a way that it isn't anywhere else in the world. And it's in large measure due to him. It
is. And look, I truly believe it ultimately cost him the race. There's no question about it. That was what really got the folks who were up for, the folks who were up for grab. But it just goes back to the earlier thing we were talking about, is there's a cooked in battlefield, and there's like almost, within, maybe there's some crazy things you could do, but it really is hard to move people even on something as serious as that.
Right. Amazing. Something that we've been fighting about on our political panel that I host up here every week. Did Trump close well? He had the rallies and they were impressive and they were big. I thought he had no message in those rallies. I thought he was not nearly as focused on the economy and things like that as he'd been in 2016. I discounted his post-COVID diagnosis campaign as bizarre. I have somebody else on my panel who's a conservative who said, no. Said before the race, no. Like, he is barnstorming this thing away from Biden. Like, he is closing hard, and it's going to matter. What's your take?
I don't think that's what happened. I think that it's a mirage that he did because of the bad polling. And there wasn't some huge swing that happened at the end. I just think that there's just a huge amount of things that we didn't account for in our polling. And I think, as a matter of fact, it's kind of funny. I've read a couple of accounts of, obviously I don't know the truth of this, but some of the accounts of the polling the Trump campaign was relying on, and that showed the thing, much, much closer. And that's why they were so dismissive of the rest of the polling. And, I think they frankly knew something we didn't know. And so I actually, that wasn't the thing. That was a momentum play. it probably helped him a little bit. But the crazy thing about his campaign was, kind of doing I think we touched on this earlier, was completely rejecting mail-in voting and essentially putting like all the chips on one day. And
yeah,
that just like, if you just said, so just like forget whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or whatever, is if you just do the math on that, who's going to come out better? Someone who has somewhere between, 2 weeks and a month, or maybe even a month plus, to get in a whole bunch of votes, or someone who's got 1 day to get in a bunch of votes. I mean, that's common sense. I don't care what sideline you're sitting on. And it's kind of like in the famous saying in the NBA, you don't get any points for shots you don't take, and you just get a lot more shots. It's just crazy.
Okay, so we keep coming back to the fact that there's this hard group of people that are immovable. You can't talk to them. You can't persuade them. Nothing, even something like COVID doesn't affect them. Do you think those people, like right now, I'm feeling like Trump's attempt to delegitimize mail-in ballots has not worked, and that the votes are being counted and all is proceeding. Do you think that 50% that's his, do you think they accept this result?
No.
Or do they believe it's illegitimate somehow?
I'm sure they believe it's illegitimate. But the real question is not, what they believe in the short term, because politics is emotions. The real question is, and there are these voters, and we saw them in the midterm elections, and we can, a lot of them, especially were suburban women. I think there's a lot of young people as well. I think there's a whole lot of hope. I do think there's a lot of stuff cooked in that you're not going to change. But I think there are a lot of people who, have shown, that you can, that they're completely reachable. And the great thing about a Biden-Harris administration is, I truly do believe, and I'm going to use an old term, but it kind of applies because it's Joe Biden. Here's a person. It's going to be wonderful having someone in the White House who understands, like lunchbox or lunch pail issues, because that's where we need to make a difference.
Right. What was happening outside of Cuban Americans in Miami? What was happening with the Latino vote? You must be pretty familiar with that from winning California races. And did Trump make real inroads there? And if so, is that something that Democrats need to think about, or we need to think about? Because a lot of the hope for the future is that the demography is against the Republicans and the demography is against Trumpism. But that's different if Latinos become Republicans.
You're 100% right. And just, the arc of this is long, and it's kind of, but in this case, it's informative. When Reagan came into politics in California in 1966, and then one of the transformative things, and he understood this when he ran for president later, was there really is an ability for Republicans to appeal to Latino voters. And it's just, and it's not so surprising. It's like just basic, like aspirational messages about how, you can get you and your family ahead in the society and help overcome all the barriers, a lot, especially economic ones, really resonate. And I honestly think, again, back to the lunch pail politics, that a lot of it is just, there is a sentiment, I believe, in the Latino community that the vote has been taken for granted for too long. And I think there's some truth to that. But I think the larger underlying truth is that we're not necessarily addressing the issues of deep importance to that community in a way that moves voters.
What would be an example of an issue that we don't get or address properly? And I
Well,
use we loosely to associate myself with you, although I can't. But
yeah, I will. I'll tell you two issues that, at least in California, just always seem to rise to the top with Latinos that don't get talked about, and is education, quality of education, and access to education. Always seems to, again, because it's a very aspirational community, and that's something that I don't even remember anyone talking about hardly in the presidential campaign. That's an example, and the other issue which does get talked about, is access to healthcare. So but it's just it's under the kind of to some degree or another. A lot of these communities are, and you kind of have to. Florida's a little bit of a different thing, right? Because of but I spent a lot of time in Texas, and it felt a lot like California. And you just have to kind of wrap your brain around that. A lot of that, if you go to a Home Depot, right? You're going to kind of run into a group of people who maybe 40, 50 years ago were Charlie the plumber. And that's who I think a lot of the upcoming Latino voters are economically aspirational. They're incredibly invested in the futures of their children and their families. So it's just a matter of, honestly, of understanding their issues, which are frankly core democratic issues. So this shouldn't be so hard.
Right. Okay. My last technical question, because I've got a panel member that wouldn't forgive me if I didn't ask you this. The Democrats decided not to do door-to-door get out the vote because of COVID, is my understanding. Was that a factor? Did the Republicans have a better get out the vote operation, do you think?
Well, it's so mechanically different. Driving mail-in votes than door to door, and like I think the Biden campaign did one of the best jobs of any national campaign I've ever seen. But just to give you an example, in the little nation state of California, right, where I'm constantly doing these races, and you're talking about an electorate of now 21 million people. If you just do the math, as good as it makes you feel to want to do door to door and canvassing and all the traditional stuff, you would to really move numbers in a significant way with the traditional field campaign in California. It would probably take like $100 million just to do that. There's some huge amount of money just because to scale it that big and do it in a way that is really impactful and not just making you feel good. So what do you do? What makes sense to do in a place like California in the United States is, since we actually have these 29-day voting windows, what makes much more sense to do is figuring out who has votes in their hands for 29 days and just, by air, by land, by sea, drive in those votes. And you obviously can be a lot more efficient, but you just have to, you can't just tackle it with a knock on the door. You have to tackle it with phones, with texting, with emailing, with, reaching out into people's, or having people reach out into their own social networks. There's 100 ways to do this, but you have to do it 100 ways, but you can be incredibly effective and efficient across a population of 21 million because for two reasons. First of all, it's relatively easier to cast a vote by mail than it is to show up somewhere. And number two, in California, for instance, you have 29 days to make the case and to make it happen. So it's just they did the right thing and they did it brilliantly.
Cool. I'm really worried I'm abusing your time on a very busy day and a very busy time for you. So maybe one last question, Ace, which is your longtime colleague, Kamala, is going to step onto the stage tonight in a different way than she's ever stepped onto it before. and she's going to be the vice president, and we're going to see her for at least the next 4 years in that capacity. What can you tell us about her and what we should expect from her in that role and in the government generally? Tell us a little bit about your friend Kamala Harris.
Well, let me start on the essential part of your question, which is, I think, as I understand it, is how well will she do? And the answer, she's going to do tremendously well. I mean, so one of the great ironies about as much as Republicans like to mock people coming out of San Francisco politics, because it seemed like if you succeeded in San Francisco politics, it's kind of like if you play baseball in the Dominican leagues and then you go to the big leagues and you go, this thing is hard. I mean, you were talking, she grew up and came out of a cauldron where you had to to get elected in San Francisco. You have to talk to a zillion people. You have to navigate endorsement processes that would literally peel the paint off of a wall. You have to multiple debates, multiple community forums, and in those times incredibly aggressive press. So not only does she have game, but she has like experience that is almost hard to overestimate how valuable those training grounds were and how good. And also, here's the other thing to remember about her that people overlook. She also professionally professionally came of age in the courtroom. And she came of age in the courtroom, not today where a lot of it's all done by computers and people in libraries. Really, in the days when it really was Perry Mason, and you walked into these courtrooms and you had to persuade juries and judges and move folks. It's almost kind of like I used to watch Bill Clinton and wonder why he got so good at speaking, and a lot of the reason was because he was a Southern politician who had to go from town to town, picnic to picnic, barbecue to barbecue, and on that circuit, and that's where he, and in her case, ironically, it was through persuading juries, really getting your arguments together, but also being incredibly impactful as a professional, and then literally growing up in this cauldron of San Francisco and honing all those skills even further. But plus, look, she's also incredibly, and you can't underestimate this, just an incredibly talented person, period.
Well, thanks a lot. And we're looking forward to it. And it's exciting. Let's just put it that way. It's very, very exciting. And thank you for your role in making all that happen. And thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, Ace. I really hope I get a chance to see you and Laura again, and I hope you're both well.
Thank you.
Throughout this period. And I'll either get down to see you, or as promised, I will bring you up to Toronto for a baseball game when Canada allows baseball to be played in Canada again.
Deal. Thank you.
Deal.
A great honor and a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for doing it, and good luck tonight. Take care.
Okay, take care.
Bye.